Now, the US has escalated airstrikes on targets in Yemen, killing dozens of people over recent weeks. President Trump has warned the Houthi military group, responsible for hundreds of attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, will be, quote, completely annihilated under his watch. Well, this all comes as a US delegation travelled to Oman to meet with Iranian leaders regarding their nuclear capabilities. But who exactly are the Houthis, and why is the disruption they're causing so much interest to President Trump? Well, with me to discuss, as ever, is Mikey Kay, a former assault helicopter and senior officer in the British military and co-host of the Security Brief. And as always, Mikey will deliver this brief as he would to his generals. Well, Mikey, thanks for being with us. Let's start with the US and Iran talks that we saw over the weekend. What do we know that came out of that meeting?
Short answer is, Gita, not a lot. But it is a starter for 10. A bit of context, Trump pulled out of the Obama negotiated Iran deal. Obama negotiated the Iran deal in 2015. Basically, it was a deal that would give more transparency to what Iran was doing in terms of furthering its nuclear aspirations, enrichment specifically. Trump then pulled out of that in 2018 during his first term, saying that he would negotiate a better deal. So here we are. So last weekend we had a meeting. Trump's special envoy for the Middle East was there, Steve Witkoff. We've spoken about him on the Security Brief before, former real estate developer. And also Iran's foreign minister was there, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. However, the interesting bit is they weren't actually in the same room together. They were in Muscat in Oman, and they were in separate rooms. And the person that was negotiating the sound bites from either party was the foreign minister of Oman. So that's kind of where we're at. It's negotiated the setting for a second talk. But I think what's really important, and I'm going to quote Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth after the meeting. This is what Pete Hegseth said, quote, "If we can't figure this out at the negotiating table, then there are other options to include my department," talking about the US Department of Defense, "to ensure that Iran never has a nuclear bomb." He said, "We hope we never get there, but what we're doing with the Houthis and what we're doing in the region, we've shown a capability to go far, to go deep and to go big." And that soundbite will become a little bit more important later on.
Well, we are taking a focus here today on Yemen and the Houthis, and we are seeing what seems to be increased strikes. So what's the latest on that?
The strikes have escalated significantly over the last month, since March the 15th. If we go slide, this is a confirmed footage from a battle damage assessment of US strike near the Houthi-controlled capital of Yemen, Sana'a, and that was last night. Now, the US military command, CENTCOM, which is responsible for all airstrikes in this region, hasn't acknowledged these strikes. It hasn't claimed them, and that's been typical over the last month from CENTCOM. They haven't claimed any of the strikes. What you would normally see is something called a battle damage assessment, a BDA, especially, and that BDA would come from the sensor of a drone surveilling the target, looking at what damage has occurred, especially when you're talking about what's called HVTs, high-value targets, or TSTs, time-sensitive targets. But we haven't had any of that, which I think is interesting. Now, CENTCOM do say that over 200 strikes have been launched in the last month, which is significant. And the Houthis are claiming that 120 people have been killed in those airstrikes. But the Houthis are also claiming that they shot down a US MQ-9 Reaper drone with their own surface-to-air missiles. Let's go slide. So this is the MQ-9 Reaper drone. And what's really interesting about this is that drones historically started in an ISR role, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. But you can see from this drone, it has evolved, and it's evolved into what's called kinetic activity. So strapped under that drone, the large bomb you can see is a precision-guided munition. And then the smaller missiles you can see are laser-guided Hellfire munitions that are used supposedly to reduce collateral damage and become more accurate. So the fact that the Houthis are claiming now this is the third drone with their own surface-to-air missiles is it's difficult for the US because these are very expensive, but they're also very capable, and they're being used a lot in what's going on at the moment.
And the geography of Yemen is really important to understand here, isn't it? Just talk us through that.
Yeah, slide. Let's go to slide and look at the region. I mean, the capital city is Sana'a. Hopefully that'll come up in a second. There we go. You can see Sanaa up there, and then there's a strategic port of Hodeidah. Now those two strategic cities, the political capital and the port, they're controlled by the Houthis at the moment. Borders-wise, to the north you've got Saudi Arabia, to the east you've got Oman. But what I wanted to point out from this is I've marked Djibouti on this map, and Djibouti is a country in Africa that is closest to Yemen. That strait that you can see there, the Bab el Mandeb Strait, that's 25 miles long, that's 40 kilometers wide, so it's not significant. The other big thing about Djibouti is that the largest US base in Africa, called Camp Lemonnier, is based in Djibouti. And that's where the US historically have been launching not just targeted operations on Yemen, but you've got Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and just basically spreading that airstrike capability across the region. So I think Djibouti is important when it comes to the strikes that are going on at the moment.
And other than the US, who exactly has been carrying out airstrikes on Yemen? Yeah,
we've got some footage here. Let's go slide, please. This is video footage. What you can see there is a British UK Typhoon jet that's taxiing for airstrikes on Yemen out of the RAF base in Cyprus. And there you have US Navy F-18s launching off the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier. The US have 10 aircraft carriers, which is huge. Russia only has 1, China's got 3. And that is a critical capability when it comes to power projection and force projection, because it doesn't require the US to have what's called home basing, i.e. relying on their jets and relying on another country to accept their jets to conduct those strikes. So that's important. Other countries that have also been launching strikes, we've seen long-range strikes from Israel's IDF on Houthi targets, and then we've got the Saudis and a Saudi-led intervention, which we'll come to a bit later in 2015.
Now, we had Signalgate a couple of weeks ago, where people might remember the Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, shared seemingly classified information about a strike on the Houthis in a messaging chat. Though whether it was classified or not was obviously a subject of debate, but it did include a journalist. So what do we now know about how that strike was carried out? Yeah,
well, we covered that on a show a couple of weeks ago. I think what's important now is that text information gives you an idea of the type of strikes that they're conducting. So a lot of the US strike capability is coming from the USS Harry Truman that is based in the Red Sea. We can go slide. This is daytime footage of F-18s launching off the USS Harry Truman. And that was really interesting, Geeta, about the text messages. For example, they were talking about 2 packages of F-18s that were launching off the carrier into what's called a trigger window. So the F-18s will get airborne, they'll go into what's called a stack or a hold, and then they're waiting for a trigger mechanism. The trigger mechanism can be based off human intelligence, which is an informant, for example, image intelligence from a drone, or ELINT. ELINT is being able to listen into a phone call. Basically, anything identifying what's called a PID, a positive identification on that target that the F-18s would drop a bomb on. Now, if none of that intelligence became available in the trigger window, the text messaging also said that there would be drones that would launch irrespective of whether that trigger window was triggered or not, and they would go in with that. So that's a composite package. You've got F-18s on the carrier, and then you've got MQ-9 Reapers, probably launched from Djibouti, hence the strategic position of Djibouti. So that just gives you an example, if you like, of the type of operations that are being conducted and the importance of carriers.
Yeah, so the strikes are not just from the Truman carrier then?
No, not just from the Truman carrier, not just from Djibouti. The US also have warships in the Red Sea. They're launching what's called TLAMs, Tomahawk Land Attack Cruise Missiles. Incredibly capable. They fly subsonic, but they fly very low. And the fact that they fly very low means that they can avoid Houthi radar and actually be quite accurate in their targeting. But this is the bit I want to talk to you about tonight, is the B-2 stealth bomber. If we can go slide, please, I'll show the viewers what a B-2 looks like. The US have admitted using these long-range B-2 stealth bombers for strikes on Yemen in October 2024 under the Biden administration. So they used to basically hit underground facilities used by the Houthis that cruise missiles won't be effective on, or F-18 jets. Now, you may ask, where are these B-2s coming from? This is a satellite image, which was provided by Planet Labs. And this satellite shows 6 B-2 Spirit bombers on the apron. And it's at a US military base in Diego Garcia called Camp Thunder Cove. Now, those 6.2 B-2 bombs are 30% of the US's B-2 stealth capability. So that in itself shows you the significance that they're putting on this. But if the B-2s are being launched from Yemen, on Yemen, they are highly likely being launched from Diego Garcia.
And how far is Diego Garcia from Yemen?
I was hoping you'd ask me that question. A long way. Slide. So that little red dot in the bottom right hand of the screen are a group of islands actually closer to Sri Lanka and the southern tip of India than they are Yemen. Yemen's in the top left-hand corner. That is around 4,000 kilometers distance, and it's around 5.5 hours flying time. So around 11 hours total on the mission there and back, depending on time over target. And these are $2 billion a pop, Geeta. $2 billion for that aeroplane. So there's a lot of money being spent, and there's a lot of priority being spent on this particular capability of being able to deep strike the Houthis. Now, that quote that I said from Hegseth before, the Secretary of Defense for the US, this is what he was referring to when he said the US had the capability to go far, to go deep, and to go big when he was talking about the negotiations with Iran.
And if people are still trying to work out how we got here, just talk us through a bit of the history. It's incredibly complex, isn't it?
It is. You've been reporting on this for a long time. I know you know a lot about it, but for the viewers, let's go slide, please. This graphic is from 2023, but it gives you a good representation of who controls what. And I'll talk the viewers through what we're seeing on the screen there. In green, in grey, you have the Yemeni government forces, and there's a small piece of territory around the city of Taiz, which is the third largest city in Yemen. That's Yemeni government forces at the moment. Then the crossed hatch black pockets. This is interesting. This is controlled by AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And their mandate is to attack foreign targets. They've been quite quiet of late. Islamic State kind of took over from that. But this group was responsible for, I don't know if you remember, we were talking about this earlier on, the attack on the USS Cole warship in 2000, which killed 17 US sailors. So I think there's a conversation there, isn't there, about, yes, the Houthis are being attacked, but the unintended consequences, as we saw in Iraq in 2003, you create a security vacuum. And when you create a security vacuum, in Iraq in 2003, for example, Al-Qaeda in Iraq stepped into the plate, which then morphed into Islamic State in Iraq, which then morphed into Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So there has to be some analysis here on the secondary and tertiary consequences of what's going on at the moment. Now, the Houthis, if we can go back to the slide, please. The Houthis are in purple, and they control most of west of Yemen, but importantly, the political capital and the strategic port. And then finally, I just want to touch upon the group in the orange. This group has been making overtures. These are anti-Houthi forces, and they've been making overtures to the US government about military support, knowing that obviously the US are now attacking the Houthis. And I think what's interesting here is I'm watching intelligence feeds closely to see if the US might do what they did with the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, or what Russia has done with Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine, if they will ally with these anti-Houthi forces and create some form of proxy force.
So we are focusing on the Houthis. Tell us who they are and how much power and control do they currently have? Religious
denominations-wise, they're a subset of the Zaidi branch of Islam, formerly known as Ansar Allah, supporters of God, that means. They emerged in the 1990s. They take their name from their former late leader, Hussein al-Houthi. And then in the early 2000s, they started rebellions against the longtime authoritarian President Salah. And basically, they want more autonomy for the group's homeland in the north of Yemen, where they've existed for hundreds of years. So that's sort of who they are as an entity.
Well, we're joined now by the former US Ambassador to Yemen, Gerald Firestein. Thank you so much for being with us. We were just discussing the politics. It's incredibly complex, but 5 million people have been left on the brink of famine. How did we get to this position? You were in the country at a crucial period.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you. In fact, I think Mikey touched on a number of the key elements, the key factors in the development. It started, the Houthi movement really started with opposition to the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh, primarily because there was a view among many of the Zaidi Shia that the country was increasingly tilting towards a very Saudi-focused Wahhabi kind of Sunni Islam, and that their Shia identity was being lost. So they started a movement called the Believing Youth, which then evolved under the leadership of Hussein al-Houthi into a armed opposition to the Saleh government, fought annually, really, for 6 straight years between 2004 and 2010 against the Saleh government. When the opposition to Saleh as part of the Arab Spring started in 2011, the Houthis aligned themselves with the opposition and participated in all of the opposition activities up to and including the completion of the GCC transition agreement, the blueprint that was to allow for a peaceful political transition, and also provided a framework for addressing many of the other grievances in the country, economic, political, social, including the Houthi grievances. So they were part of all of that. That as that process neared completion, however, they began again armed opposition to the transition government, the government of Abdul Rasul Hadi, and eventually took the capital of Sana'a, ejected the Hadi government, took over control, and that triggered the civil war, which has now been going on for over 10 years.
Gerald, it's Mikey here. You were involved in a lot of the meetings that built up to the National Dialogue Conference. What were the main challenges in those meetings that you were facing in terms of the negotiation aspects?
Well, it was really, the National Dialogue Conference itself was actually very well organized and was, by most measures, quite successful in addressing many of the issues, many of the challenges, provided a number of recommendations on things that could be done that would improve the lives of the Yemeni people. It would improve governance. It would improve economic opportunities and the delivery of essential services. So within the context of the GCC transition agreement, there was quite a lot of success. The problem was that outside of that framework, what was going on in the country more broadly, the situation was deteriorating very quickly. The Hadi government was not successful in addressing the security issues that had come up. The economy was going badly. There were a number of attacks on key infrastructure, power, water, particularly to the capital, Sana'a. And so even though the conference was going on, the Yemeni people were becoming increasingly discouraged by the direction that the country was moving in. And the Houthis were able, as they turned away from that political process, as they turned more towards armed insurrection, they had a lot of popular support because people were frustrated and demoralized.
Jerry, fast forward to 2024. I was speaking to Geeta just before we spoke to you about these anti-Houthi opposition forces. In your experience, do you see the US aligning with them and using them as a proxy?
It's certainly conceivable, and in the past, as people have discussed various options, it is one that perhaps has more resonance than the others. The airstrikes are of limited utility, to be entirely honest. They will not defeat or deter the Houthis. The U.S. and its allies, the British, the French, others are not going to go in on the ground into Yemen. It would be insane to even think about it. But the possibility of aligning and providing some kind of training and assistance to the anti-Houthi elements, and it's your map distinguished between the Southern Transition Council, the group that you showed in orange, and the government, but they are technically aligned. The Southern Transition Council participates in the Presidential Leadership Committee. that is the governing body for the government. The anti-Houthi elements in green that you showed in the southwest corner also aligned with the government. And so there is, in fact, armed opposition. They are not as well armed. They are not as well equipped. When the Houthis moved in with the support of Ali Abdullah Saleh into the capital in 2014, most of the military brought with them their equipment and aligned themselves with the Houthis. So most of the former government's military capability is now with the Houthis. It would be a long trajectory to try to build up the capacity of these government-aligned forces to be a real challenge to the Houthis. We have seen, however, that there is some idea, some movement again towards perhaps organizing an assault on the port of Hodeidah. There was a plan in 2019 to do that. It was sidetracked by an agreement that was negotiated by the United Nations, the so-called Stockholm Agreement, that foreshortened planning. That may be back on the table. There may be some ideas about ways that they can pressure the Houthis to change their tactics and perhaps turn again towards ways of ending the civil war in Yemen, as well as perhaps even ending their attacks in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, and against Israel.
Gerald Firestein, sorry to have to end it there, but former U.S. Ambassador to Yemen, we're very grateful to you for your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Mikey, just bringing it right up to date, is there a political mandate needed by the US and the UK under multiple governments that we have seen for these airstrikes and military support for this action being carried out?
I think this is the number one question we should be asking at the moment. If you look at the US, it's what's called the AUMF, which is the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. That was signed in September 2001. That's 24 years old. Let me give you a quote from that. The President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001 or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of intentional terrorism against the United States. I can't see that mandate covering what is going on now. Now, if we go to the UK side, again, this is quite muddied. We spoke about this before today, but in UK constitutional terms, the government is under no legal obligation to seek approval from Parliament or keep Parliament informed. However, we all saw 2003 and the invasion of Iraq. So pressure from the public, pressure from parliamentarians forced Tony Blair to seek that approval, which it did. The UK vote was 412 to 149. And that is what sent me to war in 2003. This was actually the third tour of Iraq that I conducted. But the point being is that by putting it to the vote, you are sending men and women into combat, and there has to be a very, very good reason for that. And in 2003, we know there wasn't. There were no weapons of mass destruction. But then you look at sort of other aspects that have occurred. So in Libya 2011, the NATO-led bombing in Libya, that was voted on by government 557 to 13. In Syria, David Cameron asked for parliamentary approval to bomb the Syrian government targets after the alleged use of chemical weapons. That was voted down. And then in Syria 2015 against Islamic State, that was actually approved by 397 votes to 23. So finally, in Syria again, going back to 2018, the US, UK and France launched attacks on Bashar al-Assad's facilities, but Theresa May didn't ask for parliamentary approval. She just went ahead and did it and then responded to Parliament afterwards. So there are cases where they have, and there are cases where they haven't. But the big question is going back to the AUMF in the US, 90% of Congress who exists today in the US were not present when that approval was signed back in 2001. So there are definitely overtures for the US to re-scrub that, because at the moment the president has any power to go via Congress and go and bomb whatever he or she chooses to do.
Yeah, especially with Donald Trump again talking quite tough on Iran, which is of course seen as one of the key sponsors of the Houthis. Mikey Kate, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for that. This is BBC News. Thanks for watching The Security Brief.